Good afternoon, my name's Cameron Petrie. I'm from the University of Cambridge, and I'm going to be speaking to you today about radiocarbon dating in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC in Iran and the lessons that we've learned from the ARCANE Project. Right, so just to explain a little bit of background, the ARCANE Project is a broad research project that was started about 5 or 6 years ago, which is familiar to many people, and it's funded by the European Science Foundation, and it was all about trying to produce an integrated chronology of the ancient Near East. And it took a broad regional approach to this sort of issue, and it had scholars working together collaboratively from various different regions, and they, the map of the ancient Near East was chopped up into various bite-sized chunks, and the one chunk that in some respects that's to deal with Iran is in many ways the largest, and I would argue is probably the most complicated one to understand, but unfortunately it was sort of very much on the sort of eastern periphery of the zones that people were interested in. But the overall project is an attempt to integrate relative chronological information and absolute chronological information, and to come up with a new chronology for the 3rd millennium BC, which is a fairly sort of ambitious thing to attempt. So the Western Iranian project was coordinated by Dr. Barbara Hellwing, who's from, was previously of the German Archaeological Institute in Berlin. And she had the difficult job of sort of trying to herd various academic cats in terms of trying to get everyone focused on the task at hand and to come up with an Iranian chronological scheme that fit into the broader chronological scheme that was being used by the ARCANE project. And this is, ARCANE is essentially trying to integrate chronological information from everywhere, from Cyprus and Anatolia, the different parts of the Levant, and northern and south Mesopotamia, and also sort of trying to draw connections with Iran. And in general, the scheme or the chronological range of the periods that work for Iran broadly work for what's going on in other parts of the Near East, but inevitably when you're trying to sort of draw this chronological correlations across huge areas, you inevitably run into a whole range of problems. One of the biggest problems is related to the way that archaeological dates plot out when they're actually analysed, and also how the sort of underlying science of the process impacts upon what you can actually do archaeologically. So effectively what I'm going to do is just talk through the nature of the radiocarbon dates and the radiocarbon dating chronologies that can be established for Iran, and then to highlight a series of, I guess, some of the fundamental issues that run around in the background, talk about some of the sites in general, and then come up with some conclusions at the end. One of the big issues, which is something that I've been trying to emphasize for several years now, is the fact that in the chronology, the radiocarbon calibration curve has a series of sort of bad areas or black spots, and one of the big ones is at the transition point at the end of the 4th millennium BC and the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. So from around 3,300 to around 2,900 BC, there's a big flat plateau on the calibration curve. And as a result of that, that means it's very difficult to differentiate dates that fall on that plateau. So dates either fall naturally before the plateau, on the plateau, or after the plateau. So across this 400-year period, it's difficult to get any fine-grained information. Now, in some respects, that's not necessarily a big problem. Where it becomes a big problem is the fact that that's the period, 3,300 to say 2,900 is the period where we have urbanism, the first writing, administrative systems, origins of complex societies in Mesopotamia, we have the Uruk world system, and we have all these other things that go on. And we have also specific Iranian things like the origins of urbanism in Iran, the origins of an Iranian writing system, and a thing called the Proto-Elamite phenomenon. So inevitably, in a period where we don't really have history, issues of relative and absolute chronology become quite important. So in order to try and solve some of these issues, the ARCANE project was sort of established. Fundamentally, it's supposed to be focusing on the 3rd millennium BC, but the Iranian team managed to encourage the project coordinators to include parts of the 4th millennium BC as well, particularly because of this sort of set of issues related to Iran. So, but as I sort of mentioned earlier, Iran is different to a lot of the other regions. It's actually the largest of the regions that's being focused on by the ARCANE Project. It spreads all the way from eastern Anatolia all the way down along the edge of the Persian Gulf and all the way across to the borders of Pakistan. So it's this enormous geographical region, and it includes a whole range of sites. Think sites like Susa, Godin Tepe, Tali Malyan, sites in the Marmasani area called Tol Espid and Tol Nurabad, a newly excavated site called Arisman, and then some older sites like Tepe Yahya as well, and probably one of the more famous sites in Iran, or the more famous recently excavated sites called Kona Sandal South. So it takes this, the area includes this enormous sweep of the western Zagros basically of Iran, but it actually leaves out about 2/3 of Iran as well. So while the broader area is large and extensive, it doesn't include everything that it possibly could. But there's various issues about the archaeology of Iran in this period that create problems in some ways. So one of the problems is the fact that this area of Western Iran is enormous, and it's also very geographically diverse. So we have big mountain ranges, we have little small mountain valleys and various sorts of other things, and all of that means that the individual archaeological sites are quite distant from each other. So the relationship's a little bit difficult. So for the whole of the 3rd millennium BC, there's actually only a relatively small number of sites that have useful occupation. The other thing that's actually quite difficult about this period in Iran is that a lot of these sites also have gaps in the occupation sequence in the 3rd millennium BC. So it's actually quite rare to have nice, neat chronological sequences that run throughout the whole phase of the 3rd millennium BC, which makes it a little bit difficult. So in general, what this ARCANE project has tried to do is choose a big chunk of Iran that's interesting, divide that up into different regional areas, and then hopefully there's enough sites in each region to build up a joined together chronology that helps answer the question. And the project itself has tried to incorporate information from new sites that have been excavated in the last 10 years, particularly sites that were excavated after the Iranian Revolution. So in the end, we've ended up with a sort of a new chronological framework. It's trying to sort of bring the whole of Western Iran under one set of terminology. And we have 6 different periods. There's a early Western Iran 1, EW1, EW0, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And EWI0 is the earliest period, so it relates to this so-called Proto-Elamite period. Then we have EW1 is the rise of the late Proto-Elamite period, where we have early texts. Then we have the decline of early urbanism in period 2, and various sorts of other chronological periods. And they have the sort of bits and pieces of different chronological chunks of time, usually 1 or 2 centuries minimum, sometimes up to 3 or 4 centuries. And in general, we have archaeological sites in each of the different regions. So we have parts of southwestern Iran, parts of southern Iran, parts of southeastern Iran. We have archaeological sites that have useful radiocarbon dates. And we also have 1 or 2 sites which in theory have a complete chronological sequence. But as I'll explain, we have problems with almost all of these archaeological sites. One of the main problems with radiocarbon dating in Iran historically is that almost all of the radiocarbon dates have been analysed using wood charcoal rather than animal bone or human bone or plant seeds. So this means that there's always at least one step removed from how reliable the date is as opposed to the actual event that you're trying to date, which creates a problem. You're not actually dating archaeological material that definitively dates to a specific period. So one of the things that was very clear is that we had a great degree of variation in the number of dates that were available. So for example, the first 2 periods, period 0 and period 1, have 59 dates. So the first 2 periods, which actually span from the period that I mentioned earlier, 3,300 down to 2,900, we've got 60 dates that all fall on this one chunk of the plateau. And in general, this sort of suggests that there's a nice degree of continuity, but the problem with all of these dates that we have available is that they're coming from the dates are collected from different archaeological sites, and they're collected from different locations on individual archaeological sites, but we don't necessarily have dates that are coming from one nice stratigraphic sequence at one site. So one of the revolutions in radiocarbon dating recently is Bayesian statistical analysis, which allows us to use a statistical program to refine the dating of absolute dates. And it works best when you've got 20 dates out of one sequence. But what we have for Iran is actually 20 dates from lots of different locations. So inevitably they all end up looking pretty much the same. It doesn't end up being improved by the statistics, unfortunately. So this first phase, period 0 and 1, we have 59 dates. Then if we look at periods 2, 3, 4 and 5, we have a total of 73 dates spread across those 4 periods. So we have a dramatic imbalance in the distribution of dates, and this is at least partly related to this fact that there's a gap in occupation at lots of sites. So the gap in the occupation means that we're trying to work out whether there is a gap or whether there isn't a gap, and part of the problem about the belief that there is a gap is because we don't have any material from the gap. So it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy in some respects. But relatively, we have many more dates for the early period and considerably fewer dates for the later period. And looking at the dates sequentially, so looking at it, the site material from one site at a time, it's quite clear that some sites are very useful, some sites are very, very problematic. And unfortunately, some of the most interesting sites are some of the ones that are the most problematic. So for example, if we look at the site of Susa, which is probably one of the most important archaeological sites in Iran, it appears to be occupied throughout the 3rd millennium BC. And there was a lot of excavation in the early 20th century, renewed excavation in the 1970s, and they clarified all of the stratigraphic relationships at the site, but they obtained very, very few radiocarbon dates. And the radiocarbon dates that they have attained are almost universally out of stratigraphic order. I'm hesitating to say useless because they're not completely useless, but they're not very reliable. They don't actually help us solve the problem. So for example, the radiocarbon dates for period 0 at Susa span from 4100 BC to 500 BC. So it's a 3,000 year period span for the radiocarbon dates for a period which is probably only about 200 or 300 years long. So there's inevitably a problem. In actual fact, the dates for period 1 at Susa are even more extended. So they go from 4,200 down to 1,800, or about 800 BC. So in general, we've got one of these incredibly important sites, but radiocarbon dates that don't help us with the chronology. So we can't answer those sorts of questions. Similarly, we have the archaeological site of Godin Tepe, which again is one of these incredibly important canonical archaeological sites, which gives us a very, very long sequence from the 4th millennium BC right up to the Iron Age. And the occupation in many ways appears to be continuous. But if we look at the radiocarbon dates, we see for some periods the radiocarbon dates contradict each other. For some periods they're very good. So for example, there's occupation in this as the ARCANE chronology period 0, 1, 2 and 3, 4 and 5. But the last period of occupation that's relevant to the 3rd millennium BC the dates span from 3000 to 500 BC. So it's actually impossible to use these dates for anything reliable in terms of chronology, which is understandably quite frustrating. One of the other problems is this issue of gaps in occupation. Now the gaps in occupation take two different forms. Some of these archaeological sites are occupied, they have a very long sequence of occupation, and then there's actually, as far as we can tell from the excavated trenches, there's a big gap. So there's no occupation in certain periods. Other sites are just abandoned completely. One of the more interesting sites is a site called Arisman, which is out on the central plateau of Iran, which is occupied in the 4th millennium BC and all the way down into the beginning of the 3rd millennium BC. So this is a site that's very, very important. It gives us information about the Proto-Elamite period. It's a site that's located next to metal resources, so it's obviously important for mining and the processing of metals and various sorts of other things. But unfortunately, it seems to be abandoned around 2600 BC. So it gives us nice information about part of the period that we're interested in, but not other bits. So in an attempt to sort of resolve some of these questions, it's useful to look at a series of other sites that give us insight into the nature of occupation and the nature of some of these gaps, and hopefully a bit of an explanation as to what's happening where we've got lots of gaps in occupation. So, for example, there's a whole series of sites across southern Iran which give us different glimpses of what's going on. So there's some sites in the Mamasani district, which is in central Fars. There's a site of Talimalyan, which is in Fars as well. And there's some sites across in the east, in the southeast of Iran, called Tepe Yahya and Kona Sandal. Now, the sites in the Mamasani district are large classic tepe sites, tell sites, which have multi-periods of occupation. Unfortunately, most of them have been damaged through modern destruction and various sorts of other things, but in terms of the archaeology, they're particularly interesting. So there's two sites that I'm just going to talk about briefly. One of them is called Tollis Speed, which has one of the best sequences of occupation dating to the 4th millennium BC. So, 8 meters of occupation spread out over 1,000 years. And then it's very clear that the site is abandoned. So there's a evidence from the excavations of a large earthquake having happened, and then the settlement is abandoned, and it appears as when we were excavating, it was not clear how long it had been abandoned for. But when the radiocarbon dates came back, it was very clear that the site had been occupied down to around 3000 BC, and then it was not reoccupied until 2200 BC. And that was an instance where the relative chronology from the pottery and the other bits and pieces of occupation matched what we saw from the radiocarbon dates. So an 800-year gap. And then there's another site located about 10 kilometers away called Tole Nurabad, which had a similar sequence of occupation, but one that was a bit more extended. So Tole Nurabad seems to continue into the early part of the 3rd millennium BC, dating to this Banesh period occupation and a late Banesh, so urban phase and then post-urban decline, and then the site itself is also abandoned around 2600, and it's not reoccupied until 1800 BC. So we have a 900-year gap. So as far as we can tell on the basis of our excavations, there are these long gaps, which is interesting chronologically. What we don't know is whether that gap is an archaeological creation. It's because of where we were excavating on the site. Thankfully, there's other sites that help us move on and solve some of the problems. One of the more interesting sites of this part of Iran is called Tali Malyan, which is an enormous sort of urban in inverted commas site. It's a mounded site, and it's surrounded by a large fortification wall. It's occupied, the urban phase is called the Middle Banesh period in the local terminology. And then it's occupied in the late Banesh period, where the site seems to become smaller, but when it becomes smaller, they surround it with a large fortification wall for some reason. And then the traditional model was that then the site was abandoned for several centuries and reoccupied in a later period, which is called the Kaftari period. These names are all named after local villages. And if you look at the radiocarbon dates, however, at least the ones that have been published and that are available, it's not obvious that there's a gap in the sequence. So we have some very, very good dates for the urban phase that all fall on this period of the plateau, 3300 to 2900 BC. And then we have dates that date to the Kaftari period at the end. And unfortunately, in the middle, we have a whole cluster of dates which have got terrible error ranges. So these dates have chronological spans of 1000 or 2000 years. So they're actually completely useless when it comes to refined radiocarbon chronology. So if you look at all of the dates, it looks like we've got a nice neat sequence of continuous occupation, which doesn't match the archaeological evidence. But if we remove the dates, it's not necessarily particularly appropriate archaeological practice, but just to take the low quality dates out of the sequence, it is clear that there's a gap in the occupation at the site. But if we look at the dates in a different way, we can actually see that the gap is again one of these issues that's partially created by the way that the archaeology has been carried out. So we only have samples from particular locations on the site. We don't have a whole sequence of dates that come from one area of excavation. And there are areas that have been excavated where we have columns of stratigraphy. In particularly, there's two trenches called H5 and H1S, and they have stratigraphy which suggests that there's continuous occupation through this period of a gap, but we don't have any radiocarbon dates from those periods. So again, we're sort of stuck. So the archaeological narrative tells us that there's a whole series of archaeological sites, particularly in this part of Iran, that have a gap in occupation. So that then means, okay, so where are the people going? When deurbanization happens, where does the population move? And at the moment, if you look at the chronological detail properly, it's possible that there wasn't a gap, but it's also possible that there was. So we're left with this sort of series of slightly unanswered questions. Thankfully, if you look further to the east, we get some answers, or at least some possible answers. So if we look at the archaeological site of Tepe Yahya, we have a site where again we have the belief that there was a gap in occupation. We have a site that's got a very, very long sequence of occupation spanning the 5th millennium BC, parts of the 4th millennium BC and onwards. And this is a very important site when it comes to sort of understanding issues of trade and other things. So it's occupied in this Proto-Elamite period, and it's occupied subsequently. And there's often well, there is a debate about the duration of the gap in the stratigraphy. There's a belief that there is a gap that in occupation at some point in the early 3rd millennium, so around, say, 2900, 2800, down to around 2400, 2200, something like that. And unfortunately, yet again, we're left in a situation where we have radiocarbon dates, but a lot of the radiocarbon dates from Tepe Yahya are particularly poor in terms of their resolution. So some of them span from 3500 to 1500 BC. So one date has got a 2000-year span. So more or less it's not very useful. And some of the dates are out of chronological order as well. But in general, there's a whole recent series of radiocarbon dates that provide useful information. At least they're more accurate. Unfortunately, they've all been taken from things like wood charcoal, so again, there's potential problems with them. But it implies that there is a gap in occupation, at least in terms of the radiocarbon dates. There's a possible gap in terms of the stratigraphy. But part of the argument about the existence of this gap is how long the gap was. And the importance of the length of the gap is all about connectivity and development and various sorts of other things. And one of the suggestions is that the gap is short, and the other suggestion is the gap is long. If we look at the radiocarbon dates, you can't differentiate the two arguments. The gap is both short and long. It's right in the middle. So again, we have a bit of a sobering lesson in terms of actually looking at the radiocarbon dates and what they can actually tell us. Now, the last site I'm going to talk about is a site called Kona Sandal South, which is a site which in many ways sort of exploded across the news waves in terms of providing evidence for where a whole series of very interesting cultural material was being produced. And new excavations were conducted over the last 10 years. And what we have from the site is very, very interesting archaeology. We have a series of 6 radiocarbon dates. Unfortunately, all but one of them are statistically identical. And it's actually another sort of carryover in terms of the standard sort of practice. So we have radiocarbon dates being collected from different areas of one archaeological site. They all date to the same period, so you either believe that the entire site dates to the one period, or you acknowledge the fact that you possibly could have got more dates from different parts of the site. It seems, interestingly enough, Kona Sandal appears to be occupied in this period of the gap that we're seeing everywhere else. So it looks like, according to the radiocarbon dates, it's occupied from 2800 down to 2100 BC. In theory, Tepe Yahya is also occupied in this period. So you can sort of see how a narrative might develop, where sites in one area appear to be abandoned, there's a gap in the radiocarbon chronology, but we have this other area a bit further to the east, so possibly that's where everyone's fleeing to. Inevitably, this is a sort of massively simplistic explanation of a complex problem, and unfortunately the radiocarbon dates, and certainly this sort of the ambitious ARCANE chronology, is not really helping the problem. And inevitably what's being caused, there's several issues that are being caused by the nature of the analysis itself. So what the ARCANE project tried to do was just put all of this chronological information into a big statistical program and more or less push the button, and hopefully the statistical program would tell you an answer. But inevitably, the statistical program is affected by where the dates are put into the sequence. So it's actually possible to, you have to look at the relative chronological framework and put the dates into that chronological framework. And if the dates don't fit, either the framework is messed around or you move the dates around until whether or not it's slightly unclear. So for some of these periods, we have a very, very close relationship between the expected date range and the actual date range that comes out. One of the things that was very, very interesting was that it was not possible to differentiate these period 0 and period 1, these two periods of the Proto-Elamite period. So even though we have 59 dates that belong to the period between 3300 and 2900 BC, because all of those dates are coming from different sites and the same occupation at individual sites, we can't clarify the periods in any way. So those two periods are statistically identical according to the model that's developed. Some of the later periods, this is sort of period 3 and period 4, we see a slight variation in the boundaries, that the sort of expected versus the actual boundaries. But inevitably that's being impacted upon where individual dates belong, because what the ARCANE Project is trying to say is, well, we have a phase change between, you know, period 3 and period 4. But because Iran is so big and so complex, some regions have occupation that continues across that boundary. So that's not necessarily straightforward to join the two. So again, it's a possibility that we've created a statistical gap or a not gap in a place where it may or may not exist. So inevitably in such a situation, we're sort of left with problems, and hopefully as a result of doing the project, we can work out a way of coming up with some solutions. So inevitably, some of the conclusions are a little bit sobering. So most of the most important archaeological sites in Iran have really poor radiocarbon dates, which is disappointing. We also know that almost all of the dates that we have available, so this is almost 140, 150 dates, almost all of them are done on wood charcoal, which we know has various problems. We don't have any radiocarbon dates from short-lived species like animals or plants. So that inevitably creates problems. Despite the fact that we've got these 59 dates from the early periods, we can't actually clarify the radiocarbon dating chronology for the Proto-Elamite period. So inevitably, if you just base it on the numbers, it's a period that can span from 3300 to 2900 BC. And in actual fact, because we lack dates from some of these major sites like Susa and Godin Tepe, we don't lack dates, that's not actually correct. We lack good dates, and because we lack good dates, we can't work out whether there is a gap or there isn't a gap, and we also can't really clarify precisely how long some of these gaps are. So in the end, we're sort of left with this situation where we have to do more archaeology, which is not necessarily so bad, but in some respects it's frustrating because it's archaeology that we shouldn't necessarily have to repeat. So we have a whole series of very, very important sites that are dated to the 3rd millennium BC, where I suspect we need to go back to sites like Susa and Godin Tepe, get more material and sample it, and be, in many ways, be more first principles in the approaches to archaeology. And in terms of thinking about the other 2/3 of Iran that I mentioned before, I think there's a whole series of other sites like Tepe Hisar and Shari Sokhta, which have occupation that's relevant, and they can be also incorporated into this new system. But inevitably, you know, as with most science, you know, radiocarbon dating and things like Bayesian analysis are vulnerable to the quality of the material you have. So I think it's important to remember that even though we have a nice date and you can publish the date and you can calibrate the date, it's not necessarily as reliable as you'd want. And I think it's sobering, and would in many ways it's something that forces you to be cautious in archaeological interpretations. Thanks.